one of my most memorable and humbling mountain moments was getting trapped in a sleeping bag at a little over 15,000 feet. And it happened back in 2004 when I was co-leading this expedition into the beautiful mountains of Peru with a small team of my ethnobotanical buddies. And we were up there to study the medicinal flora of the highland lagoons along the Ipsai Pass, which is a stretch of trail that runs from Patakancha to Lares. And a few days into our hike, it got really cold. And so I went to bed all cinched up in my mummy sleeping bag, which for those of you that don't know, an ultralight mummy sleeping bag is basically an insulated straitjacket, with barely enough room to move in or to roll around in. And it was so cold on this particular night that I cinched up all the drawstrings so there was only like this little tiny hole for my nose to breathe through. And while I was sleeping, I lost that little opening and I woke up in an experience of pure panic. At 15,000 feet, the effective oxygen content is something around 12%. And inside of my thick down sleeping bag, it became this basically saturated carbon dioxide vacuum. So in short, I woke up in an experience of real suffocation and in complete darkness. And I couldn't find that little hole for my nose to save my life anywhere. And it was a terrifying experience. And at one point, I remember literally trying to rip myself out of the sleeping bag, but all I really ended up accomplishing was to get the zipper supremely stuck. And eventually, I had to basically push myself through a tiny little opening, barely large enough for my head to fit through. And I felt like a caterpillar molting from the chrysalis. And the whole ordeal was tremendously unpleasant. So when I finally, got free and was able to step out of the tent and to try to shake off the lingering effects of claustrophobia, the moment I unzipped that tent and popped my head out and took a look at the night sky and just breathed in that crisp mountain air, I couldn't have imagined a more apropos setting for emerging from a cocoon. Because at this altitude, the night sky was absolutely majestic. And we were like hundreds of miles from the closest source of ambient light pollution. And it was a new moon, so it was really dark, but the stars themselves were bright enough to cast shadows on the landscape. And all at once I understood why the ancestors of this land paid so much attention to the stars. The Milky Way stretched across the night sky like a band of stars so bright that it looked like a river. And suddenly that Quechua term for the Milky Way made much more sense to me. They call it the Chascamayu, which roughly translates into river of stars. And the traumatic experience was instantly washed away by the beauty. And I lost myself gazing into the vastness of this timeless, infinite expanse. And I think my awestruck gaze kind of got the attention of, one of the guides. It must have looked concerning because one of our local guides who was still awake ended up walking over to probably make sure I was okay or that I wasn't experiencing altitude sickness. And when he finally realized that I was fine, we both just kind of stood there together, looking up into the vastness of the great beyond for a while. And after a long pause, through his broken Spanish and my even more broken and fragmented Quechua, he shared with me some of the most beautiful insights that I've ever heard, and ones that really changed the way that I look not only at the night sky, but also at life itself. Because other cultures end up producing things that have the capacity to completely transform our way of moving through the world. And As it turns out, our local guide was also, like his ancestral predecessors, he was an expert astronomer. And the more of the night sky that he pointed out, the more I realized how growing up in the States, in the northern hemisphere, had me basically missing half of the story. And I'm not just talking about the prominent constellations that can only be seen in the southern hemisphere, like the Patakancha, like many of you have heard it called the Southern Cross. But for the tribes that are living way up there in the mountains, the constellations aren't just these arrangements of bright stars in the night sky. The stars are so bright out there in the mountains that the defined dark spaces between all the stars actually produces this type of negative constellation. And they call this Yanafuyu. And one by one, our Quechua guides started pointing out all of these amazing silhouettes of like a llama and a serpent and a partridge and a toad, all interspersed through this brilliant band of stars they call the Chascamayo. And you know, what an incredibly different way of viewing the night sky. And as he was really describing the lore that surrounds the stars, and I was contemplating how different it was from the myths that I had been exposed to as a child, he ended up blowing my mind yet again when he started to describe how his people viewed time. And the rough conversation started with him asking me if I believed that if we were moving forward into the future. And you know, and in my broken Quechua and Spanish, I responded with something like, "Yes, of course. You know, aren't we all walking forward into the future?" And his response startled me on some level, because he said that his people didn't see it that way. He said that we believe that the past is out ahead of us. It's the Nyaupapacha. It's out in front of us, just like these stars. And I thought about it for a minute, and scientifically, I remembered that the light that we're seeing from the stars literally is the past. It's just old light. You know, basically, some of that light may even have traveled for so long that the stars that created that light might not even be there anymore. And he continued, he said, it's obvious that the past is out in front of us, right? It's already happened, so we can clearly see it through our memories. And, you know, we can share its details through the stories of our oral lineage. And we call the future the Kipakpacha, right? Which means the world behind us, you know. And I was like, okay. And as he described it, he's like, you know, how can the future be out in front of you if you can't even see it, right? The future never comes into full view. And so he asked, you know, so aren't you backing up into the mystery one step at a time? And his logic around this and this different perspective kind of fractured my paradigm, right? But in the best possible way. And it showed me how limited my default worldview was, and how I never even thought to consider an alternative. And this left me with this lifelong curiosity about other cultural perspectives and other cosmovisions that in many ways persists to this day. And looking back on this experience now, almost 20 years later, I can see how the whole experience itself was really this classic rite of passage moment for me. I mean, not only did I go through this real trial of ascending way up into the mountains, and then I had this experience where my mortality was put into question, and I awoke from this slumber through this experience of rebirth. as I pried myself out of this mummy-like chrysalis, of this mummy sleeping bag. And then I woke into an experience of the cosmos that I had never seen before. And the whole experience was pure magic. And it forever altered the context of how I orient toward life and towards time and space. And this is one of the many beautiful things that I love about the mountains. And it's why I find traveling to other countries and learning about other cultures so important and valuable. There's always this other beautiful perspective, or another way that life can be viewed and experienced that differs from my own. And experiencing these other perspectives and cultural ideas almost always enriches my experience of the world in these really rich and beautiful and meaningful ways.